Ray Keene, Grandmaster, Side 1. This tape is concerned with a personal success story, so I hope it won't become too pompous and self-satisfied. I will try to give, first of all, a brief history of my attempts to gain the title, and then move over to some extracts from my games played in the 2 tournaments where I made the 2 Grandmaster norms. In 1968, at the end of my first year at Cambridge University, I won a double-round tournament sponsored by Jim Slater, ahead of Hartston, Basman, Lee, Whiteley and Wright. Slater's idea was to support the winner financially, with the eventual idea of producing an English Grandmaster. He wanted me to drop my university studies at once and start playing chess professionally, but I refused, since I wanted to finish my degree in modern languages before concentrating on chess. In retrospect, I think this was the right decision, although in subsequent years I often wondered whether I might not have gone further in chess had I excluded all other intellectual pursuits from my mental curriculum. Slater was obviously not very satisfied with my reply, but however he agreed to defer my support until I had earned my BA degree from Cambridge. In 1970 I passed my finals and also made my first international master norm at the Siegen Olympiad, and then in 1971 came a very good chance, an invitation for me to play in the German International Championship in Berlin. Slater supported me by financing Les Blackstock as my second, and I did well in the tournament, beating Gligerich and gaining the international master title. At this point, a blow struck from a completely unexpected quarter. Slater entirely withdrew his support. This came as a great shock to me, since I had just become the first English international master since Penrose, 10 years earlier. Whether this was Slater's own decision, or whether he was prompted by advisors, I have no idea. But with 2 titles, one academic and one from FIDE, but lacking Slater's support, I was totally confused as to whether I should now commit myself to chess, or not, and my results immediately showed signs of this uncertainty. Eventually I decided to give myself a couple of years to play chess, and at the end of 1973 I finally began to approach Grandmaster norms in my tournaments, which encouraged me to continue. At the Hastings International Tournament, 1973 to 1974, I missed the Grandmaster norm by 1 point. In the Capablanca Memorial, 2 months later, I was half a point off, although the absence of Grandmasters from this event would not have permitted a bona fide norm to be materialised in any case. And then at the Nice Olympiad of 1974, I finally made it, scoring 10 out of 15 on board 2 for England in a Category 8 tournament. Later on in this tape, we'll take a look at some specimens of my play from this event. After this success at Nice, I again started to play unevenly, a strange repetition of my loss of form 2.5 years earlier, after Berlin 71. It wasn't until the end of 1975 that I was consistently playing in the Grandmaster norm area again. I had good results at Alicante 75, and later on at Aarhus, Reykjavik and Hanover, and all this culminated in the second and decisive Grandmaster norm at the Haifa Olympics of November this year. Once again I was playing on board 2 for England, and I made 7 out of 10 in a Category 8 event. This was actually 3% over the Grandmaster norm, and since I had played a total of 25 games at the Grandmaster level, I was awarded the Grandmaster title on the spot by the FIDE Commission. As a general point, it's quite noticeable that I play much better in team events for England than in individual tournaments. I don't think this has much to do with the possibility of favourable colour distributions. For example, at Haifa I played 7 titled players and 3 untitled players, and against the 7 I had 3 whites and 4 blacks. And over the whole 10 games I had 5 games with each colour. I think, actually, the reason may be that my main weakness is a psychological one, that I sometimes lack confidence when I'm playing, and it's much more this than a technical deficiency that causes me difficulties in tournaments. So I tend to play much more incisively when forced to fight under the whiplash of the team captain. Anyway, our English team captain David Anderton was of immense help to me both at Nice and at Haifa, and I think it's not a bad thing anyway to become a Grandmaster by representing one's country rather than oneself. Let's now turn to some games I played. First of all, we'll look at 2 complete games. The first one is from Nice, and the second one from Haifa. Now, please put up your pieces in the starting position. Are you ready? I was white in this game, and my opponent was Milbers of Luxembourg. I could have given you perhaps a game against a stronger opponent, but this was a nice snappy win, played in the preliminary section, and it also has a few very pleasant tactical points. Are you ready? I started off, first move, white knight to f3. And Milbers replied, black knight to f6. White's second move, pawn to c4. And Milbers played his pawn to e6. Now I had a large choice. I could have played my knight to c3, getting a kind of English opening, or else played my pawn from d2 to d4, inviting either a Queen's Gambit or a Queen's Indian defence. Another possibility would be to play the King's Knight's pawn from g2 to g3, making it into a sort of Catalan. Anyway, about this time, 1974, I just finished writing my book about Aaron Nimzowitsch, and it was due to be published in a few weeks. So, in honour of Nimzowitsch, my third move was 3, white pawn to b3, introducing the Queen's fianchetto that's so typical of Nimzowitsch's games. Also, this is rather an unusual line, and I thought it might be a good thing to unsettle my less experienced opponent. Now black decided to occupy the centre, in classical fashion, and that's just the sort of thing that Nimzowitsch liked to play against. Black's third move, black pawn to d5. White bishop came to b2. Black pawn went to c5. White pawn came to e3. And now black developed his other knight at c6. Black knight to c6. That's possibly a questionable decision, because it gives white the chance to set up a pin. Now, having given you this clue, can you spot white's next two moves? You can switch off the tape for a while if you like and think about it. Well, with that clue it probably wasn't too difficult. My sixth move was pawn takes pawn. Now, if black takes back with the queen, I can hit it with knight to c3, gaining time. Instead of that, he can also take back on d5 with the pawn. But white will eventually react with white pawn to d4, and black's going to get either hanging pawns or an isolated queen's pawn. So black chose, on move 6, knight on f6 takes white pawn on d5. And the idea of this move is to avoid losing time in development, and secondly, to eliminate any pawn weaknesses in his position. And now, as you might expect, I develop my king's bishop on b5, white king's bishop from f1 to b5, creating a kind of reverse Nimzo-Indian defence, where of course white enjoys a couple of extra tempi. Now black's best is to prevent the doubling of his c-pawns, and he quite sensibly played his bishop from c8 to d7. White castled, and black retreated his knight from d5 to f6. The point of this is to block the action of white's queen's bishop on the long diagonal, so that he can comfortably develop his king's bishop without losing his king's knight's pawn on g7. But of course black's falling a little bit behind in development now. White's ninth move, knight from b1 to c3. Black's bishop went to e7. White queen came to e2. And now black played his pawn from a7 to a6, posing a question to my bishop. What should white play here? I think this would be another good moment to switch off the tape and consider white's possibilities in this position. Well now, what did you think the white bishop should do? Of course, it's out of the question to play the bishop to a4 or c4. Black would just play b5 and chase the poor bishop away, and white would lose a lot of time. In fact, if it went to a4, b5 would simply win a piece. Another possibility, and this is one I considered for a long time, was to play on move 11, bishop b5 takes knight on c6. Black has to take back on c6 with his bishop. And then to place white's knight on e5. At first I thought this might give white good attacking chances, but gradually I came to the conclusion that black could simply defend his bishop on c6, for example by playing a rook to c8. And then the absence of the white squared bishop from white's position wouldn't give him sufficient chances for the initiative. So, please replace the white knight on f3, put the black bishop back on d7, give black his knight back on c6, and put the white bishop back on b5. The move I eventually hit on was rather an original one, and I'm very proud of it. I moved the bishop back from b5 to d3. Now it looks very strange to do this because it blocks the d pawn, but my plan was as follows. I'll develop both the rooks on d1 and c1, I'll slip the bishop back to b1, and I'll play d4. I'll open up the centre, and then my bishops on b1 and b2 will be admirably poised for an assault against black's kingside. It's obvious black has to castle kingside. He can't even think about castling on the queenside in view of the open c-file. I think bishop d3 confused my opponent a bit. He certainly wasn't expecting that. And his next few moves are a bit careless. He castled at first, black castled, that's okay. And I played rook on a1 to c1, making a hole for my bishop on b1. Black played his rook from a8 to c8. I played rook f1 to d1, all according to plan. Black queen came to c7. I think that's a bit dubious. It seems very risky, in my opinion, to put the queen on the same file as my queen's rook. Anyway, it's probably not fatal yet. My bishop slid back from d3 to b1. And now, perhaps you should switch off again and see what black should play in your opinion. What did you think about this? Probably the most sensible move is to retire the queen, probably to b8. Another idea would be to play the rook from f8 to d8, so that black's king has a sort of escape avenue on the squares f8 and d8 if ever white strikes up a kingside attack. What my opponent actually played was to move his pawn from b7 to b5. Now, this is really a very careless error. It does nothing for his position at all. First of all, it slightly weakens his pawn on c5, which can't ever be protected by b6. Secondly, it creates some holes on the queen side. And thirdly, it does nothing at all against white's intended advance in the centre. The move doesn't even have a threat. If black advances his pawn from b5 to b4, white simply gets a wonderful square for his knight on a4, where it can attack the black c-pawn on c5. And then white can simply build up an attack against the c-pawn, and one day it will fall. So after b5, I played my pawn from d2 to d4. Black took it with his pawn, and I took back with my pawn on e3. White pawn takes black pawn. Now, normally in my games, I don't like to get a position with an isolated queen's pawn. Everybody knows that if you have the IQP, isolated queen's pawn, you get some attacking chances in compensation. But I tend to prefer having a position where my opponent has the IQP, and I can blockade it. But this case is a big exception. White's pieces are so well placed in the centre that black can't possibly avoid the thrust, pawn on d4 to d5. With this move I get rid of the IQP and open up lines for my pieces, so the weakness in white's position is a very temporary one. Black's next move was to move his queen from c7 to b7, which reinforces my comments about the unwisdom of putting his queen on the same file as my rook. I could ask you to guess white's next move, but I've dropped so many hints it's hardly necessary. I pushed the pawn from d4 to d5. Black took it with his pawn. I replied, knight c3 takes pawn d5. Of course, black has to eliminate this knight. It's much too strong otherwise. Knight on f6 takes knight on d5. Rook d1 takes knight on d5. And now black played his bishop from d7 to e6. Now, it's quite clear that white must have some wonderful combinative possibilities in this position, based on a sacrificial attack against the black king. But which is the right one? That's the question. I strongly advise you to switch off now and have a good think about the position. Look at all the attacking possibilities, and then decide which is the right one. And then I'll go over the various ideas afterwards. Switch off now and have a think. Now, in this position, what I wanted to do was to unleash the beautiful combination bishop on b1 takes black pawn on h7 check. Black king has to recapture, of course. King takes bishop. White queen comes to e4 check. Now it's quite clear that if the pawn goes to g6, white rook goes to h5 check, and it's mate. That's a very simple variation. Put the black pawn back on g7. Similarly, if the king retires to g8 after queen e4 check, rook h5, and there's no defence to mate. Put the white rook back on d5, and the black king back on h7. So, that seems to leave only king from h7 to h6. Now, in this sub-variation, switch off again and see if you can find white's beautiful mate. Did you find it? It's all with checks. After the king goes to h6, the white rook comes to h5 check. Black has to take it. White queen goes to h7 check. Black king has to go to g4. White rook comes to c4 check. Pawn takes rook. White pawn to h3 check. Black king has to go to f4. And now bishop from b2 to c1. And that's it. Well, I didn't play any of that. Perhaps I should have risked it, but there's something wrong with it. Please replace the pieces. Put the white bishop back on b2, white pawn back on h2 from h3, black pawn back on b5 from c4, white rook back on c1, white rook back on d5, white queen on e4, and the black king on h7. Now, in this position, black has a much better defence. He simply plays his pawn from f7 to f5, parrying the check. I have to play queen takes bishop on e6, and all I've done is won a pawn. Of course, white's winning easily. He's a pawn ahead and he has some attack. Although I wanted to try this brilliant variation, I saw that I had something much more effective, although a bit more prosaic. Please replace the white queen on e2, put the black pawn back on f7, black king back on g8, black pawn on h7, black bishop on e6, and the white bishop on b1. Now, here we were considering bishop takes pawn h7 check, but what I actually played, reluctantly, was rook from d5 to h5. Now it's obvious black can't play pawn from h7 to h6, white just plays queen e4. So he has to play pawn from g7 to g6. Switch off for a moment and see if you can find white's next crushing move. Did you spot it? It's not very difficult. Bishop on b1 takes pawn on g6. Obviously black can't take back with the h-pawn, he has to take back with the f-pawn. f7 takes g6. Queen e2 takes bishop e6 check. The black rook has to come to f7. And now see if you can spot the knockout blow. There are two of them. One's a queen sacrifice, big hint, and one's a rook sacrifice. Once again, the answer isn't very difficult. White can play rook on h5, takes pawn on h7, which is completely decisive, or instead, and this is much nicer, queen on e6, takes pawn g6 check, black pawn h7 takes queen g6, and then rook to h8 mate. In view of these variations, black resigned after my move queen e2 takes bishop e6 check. So, that's the first of our complete games. That one was from Nice. And now we'll take a look at the best game I won from the Haifa Olympiad, which was played earlier this month in Israel. Please set up your pieces once again in the starting position. This game was played in round 11, in the match between England and Sweden. I was white, and my opponent was Jansen, Swedish policeman. My first move was white pawn to c4, inviting the English opening. Black obliged. Black pawn to e5. White knight went to c3. Black knight came to f6. I developed my other knight at f3. And black followed suit. Knight from b8 to c6. Now white has a lot of possibilities. He can try the outlandish, pawn to a3, the direct, pawn to d4, and probably the most popular choice is to play pawn from g2 to g3, followed by the fianchetto of the king's bishop. But in the last year, I've come to the conclusion that white's most flexible line, and also one of the least analysed, is to play on move 4 the white pawn from e2 to e3. And I did this in this game too. Now, perhaps you'd like to think about this position for a while. Black has a fair number of choices here. He can play d5. Looks like a nice move. But when you think about it, after white pawn takes pawn, black knight takes pawn, white bishop from f1 to b5, we've transposed directly into a variation of the Sicilian defence, except that white has a whole extra tempo. And I don't think that's too good an idea for black. Please put the white bishop back on f1, white pawn back on c4, black knight back on f6, and black pawn back on d7. Another idea would be to play on move 4 for black, bishop from f8 to b4. And in fact I think this is the most sensible choice. Black's developing his pieces quite quickly. He's also threatening to take off white's knight and reduce his influence in the centre, and he's preparing to castle. That would be the move I'd play in this position, but instead of this Jansen put his bishop at e7, bishop from f8 to e7, and this strikes me as a little bit passive. So I exploited it at once by playing my pawn from d2 to d4. Black captured the pawn with his pawn, and I took that with my knight. Knight takes d4. Now, if you think about this position for a while, you'll probably come to the conclusion that white stands slightly better. And the reason is that he has the possibility of controlling some key squares in the d-file, especially the square d5. Now black castled. And in view of my previous comment, my original idea here was to develop my bishop from f1 to e2. But after thinking for about 5 minutes, I decided that I could transfer my advantage from one of square control into pawn structure. So I abandoned bishop e2, put the bishop back on f1 if you moved it, and played knight on d4, takes black knight on c6. After b7 takes c6, black's done a lot to repair his control of the centre. But on the other hand, his pawn structure has been weakened a bit. Not that this is of decisive significance, of course, as yet, but it does mean that the position is unbalanced, and it increases the winning chances for both sides. Now I played my bishop from f1 to e2, and I think this might be a good moment to switch off entirely and think about the position. There aren't any real tactics going on yet, so there aren't any clear variations to analyse, but you might try considering what your plan would be for black in this position. Well, my feeling about this position was that black should leave his pawns in a defensive setup. He should probably place them on c7, d6 and c5, and then play to advance his a-pawn. Perhaps he shouldn't rush into this straight away. Maybe he should play bishop a6 first, or bishop b7, or even rook b8. But my essential feeling was that the pawn should stay in a crouching setup, and not advance. Actually, my opponent played his pawn from d7 to d5, and this made me very happy, because you can see that black's now given himself the equivalent of hanging pawns on c6 and d5. I like playing against the hanging pawn structure anyway, and with the addition of the double pawn at c7, I began to feel very satisfied indeed with the white position. Of course, the move d5 isn't all wrong. It gives black a good square on d6 for his bishop, and allows him to develop some sort of initiative against my king's side. But on balance, I felt that the pawn weaknesses would be more important. I castled. As expected, black moved his bishop to d6, aiming at my king. And now I prepare to develop my bishop on the long black diagonal, as in the previous game. White pawn to b3. Black queen came to e7, threatening a sneaky fork on e5. I developed my bishop at b2, and black played his rook to d8. Now I played c4 takes d5. Have a think about this position. What would you do now if black played c6 takes d5? Play the move c6 takes d5 on your set, think about the position, switch off first if you like, and decide what you play now. This is an important positional point. In the position after c6 takes d5, what I intended to play was knight from c3 to b5, with the idea of getting rid of the black dark squared bishop. Once that goes, black has no initiative at all against my king's side, and the only significant factor is the weakness of his pawns on the c-file and d-file, and the isolated a-pawn. Now, let's replace some pieces. White knight back on c3, black pawn back from d5 to c6, and white pawn back on d5. Janssen obviously agreed with me about the assessment of the position being in white's favour, so instead of recapturing simply, he inaugurated a fierce attack against my king's side. The black queen came to e5, threatening mate. Obviously I have to play g3. The black bishop went from c8 to h3, and I moved my rook to e1. And now the black bishop came from d6 to b4. And now I felt that I had to get my queen off the d-file, also protecting the knight at the same time. So I played the queen from d1 to c2. Now, this might be another good moment to switch off and think what you'd do if black played knight on f6 takes d5. This is a very important variation, and if white doesn't have a defence against that move, his position will collapse. Play knight f6 takes d5 on your set, and then switch off for a while. This position looks a bit serious for white actually. First of all, there's a threat of a sacrifice against e3. Secondly, white's looking a bit tender around the g2 square. And thirdly, there's a nasty pin against the knight on c3. But I think white can gain the advantage as follows. Knight c3 takes knight d5. Black has to take back with the queen, threatening mate by the way. Queen takes d5. White pawn to e4. Black queen to d2. Now the star move, rook on e1 to c1. Did you spot that? Miraculously, this beats off all of black's threats, and the important thing now is the weakness of black's c-pawns on an open file. You can take a few minutes to convince yourself of white's advantage here if you like, switch off if necessary, and then put the pieces back. Replace the white rook at e1, the black queen on e5, white pawn on e3, black knight on f6, white pawn on d5, and the white knight on c3. After 15 queen from d1 to c2, black's actual choice was bishop from h3 to f5, attacking my queen. Now, this drives the queen off the protection of e4, but on the other hand, the retreat of the bishop means there's no mate at g2 any longer. My queen retreated to c1. Black played c6 takes d5, undoubling his pawns. White bishop came to f3, threatening knight c3 takes pawn d5, with a disclosure against the black queen, and black's queen retreated to e7. Now, once again, I invite you to think about this position. Who do you think has the advantage and why? Switch off for a while and think about the position. I was asking you to consider the position after black's 17th move, queen to e7. Now, who has the advantage? Well, in my opinion, white does. That may seem very strange to you. Let's look at black's position. In conventional terms, he's doing rather well. All of his pieces are developed, except for the queen's rook. He has a rather tough-looking central pawn on d5, and he has a little bit of pressure against white's position. For example, the pin against white's knight on c3. Now, if we compare the white position, we'll see that one or two of the pieces aren't developed at all. The white rook on a1 seems completely hemmed in, and white's queen on c1 doesn't look too brilliant either. In fact, most of white's pieces are grovelling around on the back rank. And what little pressure he does have is directed against the pawn on d5, which looks as solid as a rock. However, it seems to me that the basic structural weakness of the black central pawns, a hangover from the double pawns I created on move 7, still persists, and white can exploit this with a neat little manoeuvre. White's next move was pawn from a2 to a3, and in my opinion black should now have taken off at once on c3, although white's clearly better in that case, since the queen can recapture on c3, white has the bishop pair, his queen's jumped into the game, and the queen's rook can get out. If you made those moves, put the black bishop back on b4 and the white knight back on c3. What he actually played was to retreat the bishop from b4 to a5. It could equally well have gone to c5, it makes no difference to the subsequent play. I continued to chase the bishop, pawn b3 to b4. Naturally the bishop has to go to b6. Black bishop to b6. And now, my dear friends, see if you can find white's next move, which justifies this whole play. You really should switch off now, and try and find the subsequent continuation. Well, what did you find? The most natural move is knight on c3 to a4. It looks very logical. It grasps the c5 square, it prepares to get rid of black's bishop on b6, it unmasks the bishop on b2, but it's wrong. For a start, it gives up the control of the e4 square. And anyway, as I've been hinting all along, the game's decided by the weakness of black's central pawns. What I actually played was knight on c3 takes pawn on d5. A sacrifice. And one of the reasons I like this game so much is that white's pieces burst into life, whilst apparently slumbering peacefully on the back rank. Of course, black can't take that with the rook. I'd simply hack off his knight on f6, and then the rook on d5 would fall. So, knight f6 takes white knight on d5. And now's the point, pawn e3 to e4. Suddenly white's bishops are moving, black's centre's dissolved, and in fact it's very hard for him to avoid material loss. switch off again for a while and see if you can find a black defence. Actually, there isn't one, so it's rather a hard task, but try and find his best chance anyway. What did you find? Obviously, bishop f5 takes pawn e4 is met by either rook takes e4 or bishop takes e4. And then we have the same sort of bishop configuration as in my previous game against Milbers. That would be very quickly over. White has a decisive attack against black's king. Another idea, and one that doesn't work, is knight on d5 takes white pawn on b4. White pawn e4 takes black bishop f5. Black bishop b6 takes white pawn f2 check. White king takes f2. Knight d3 check. King f1. And that's the end of that. White's queen is attacked, but so is black's. And the best black can do is grovel into an ending, where white has two bishops or a rook. Now, please start putting the pieces back again. Put the white king back on g1. Put the black knight back on d5. Put white pawns back on b4, f2, and replace the white pawn from f5 to e4. And give black a bishop back on f5. Also another one on b6, black bishop on b6. Now, the toughest defence, after I've moved my pawn to e4, is to slam down the bishop from b6 to e3. And then we get some nice variations. Rook e1 takes bishop e3. Knight d5 takes rook e3. Pawn e4 takes bishop f5, disclosing an attack against the rook on a8. Knight e3 retreats to d5. And now the star move, f5 to f6. Now, if black takes that with a knight, I simply remove his rook on a8 and follow up with queen c6. That's a crushing position for white. Obviously he can't leave the pawn where it is, so g takes f6 is forced. And now I have two very good choices. Either queen from c1 to c4, or queen from c1 to h6. In both cases white has a fantastic attack for the sacrificed exchange, and black's almost certainly going to lose. You can think about it for a while, but I'm sure I don't need to go into the specifics here. You can work out the variations for yourself. Now, let's put all the pieces back again. Replace the white queen to c1. Put a white rook back on e1. Give white his pawn back on e4. Take the black pawn from f6 and put it on g7. And give black his two bishops back, f5 and b6. Bishops on f5 and b6. And instead of this exciting variation, my opponent actually found a rather feeble move, which in a general sense lost at once. He played his bishop from f5 to g6. I played pawn on e4 takes knight on d5, and then he played queen from e7 to d7. Now white simply won a pawn for nothing. He's also got much the better position. So the remaining moves of the game aren't actually that interesting, but I'll go through them quickly for the sake of completeness. We should also remember that my opponent was in desperate time trouble at this point, and so he wasn't really capable of putting out what resistance there was on the position. Anyway, let's just dash through the last few moves. White queen came to c3. Black pawn went to f6. White queen's rook to d1. Black queen's rook to b8. White queen to c4. Black queen to f5. White king to g2. Black bishop to f7. White rook to e2. Black pawn to h5. Now I decided to force the exchange of queens. Queen to e4. Queen takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Rook d7. Black's only chance is to counterattack against the white d-pawn, but it's very easy to hold it. Rook e2 to d2. Rook b8 to d8. Bishop b2 to c3. That defends the rook. Rook to e7. Bishop to f3. Bishop to e8. h4, fixing a weakness. Bishop to a4. Rook to b1. Now that threatens b5, trapping black's bishop, so the bishop had to rush off again. Bishop to e8. b5. Bishop c5. Bishop b4. As a general point, it's worth forcing off pieces when you're a pawn ahead. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that though. Bishop takes b4. Rook takes b4. Rook b8. a4. Rook d8. Rook c4. A nice thematic move. Black's going to lose now because of the weakness of his pawns on c7 and a7. Black bishop went to f7. White rook went to c6. And black lost on time. If he plays his rook from e7 to d7, I can either play rook a6 or even rook on d2 to c2. Both of them win rather easily. The next thing in this tape will be the game that actually brought me the Grandmaster title. In round 12 at Haifa, England had to play against Chile, and my opponent was Donoso. Although he was playing on board 2, he actually had their highest ELO rating in the team, and he'd also performed remarkably well in previous rounds. He seemed to be a very solid player. I had white against him, and after 40 moves we reached the following position, which you should set up on your board. Are you ready? White king on d2. White rook on c3. White knight on c5. White bishop on d3. And white pawns a4. d4. e3. f2. g2. and h3. Now the black position. Black king on c7. Black rook on a8. Black knight on f6. Black bishop on c8. And black pawns a5. c6. d5. f7. g6. and h7. Now, I was white, Donoso was black, and it's important to remember that if I won this game, I became a Grandmaster. My sealed move had been rook from b3 to c3, reaching the position you should have in front of you now. And when I adjourned the game, it seemed to me that I had a few winning chances. First of all, black's pawns tend to be stuck on the same colour square as his bishop. Secondly, his c-pawn's backward. And thirdly, I've got the chance of moving my central pawns to gain some activity for my pieces. On the other hand, I can't really avoid the exchange of my knight on c5. Now in some ways that's my best piece. But after black's best move, which in fact he played, knight from f6 to d7, I can't move the knight away in view of knight b6, and that's quite okay. So I had to seek some other way of transforming my advantage into something tangible. I played pawn from e3 to e4. Black knight took on c5. White rook took back on c5. Black took on e4, white bishop took on e4, and black played bishop d7. That's to defend his c-pawn, of course. Now, this would be a very good moment to think deeply about the position, and see if you can find some way for white to proceed. Switch off now and have a think about it. What did you find? Did you try and win at once with d5? Black plays king d6 in reply to that, and white gets nowhere. Put the pawn back on d4, and black's king back on c7. Perhaps you thought of bishop takes c6. Black has to take back on c6 with his bishop, and then d5 again. Well, black just plays king d6 again, and that's no use. Put black's king back on c7, white pawn back on d4 from d5, black bishop from c6 to d7, white bishop on e4, and the black pawn on c6. No, white can't win this position tactically at all. He has to play positionally, and the way to do it is to exploit the activity of the rook on the 5th rank and the bishop on e4, both of which are aiming at black's king side and his queen side, by gaining space in the only sector left, and that's the king side. So I played pawn from f2 to f4. Black king went to b6. That's a very sensible decision. He defends both his weak pawns and frees his rook. I played g4, g2 to g4, quite in line with my previous decision. Black rook went to e8. I defended my bishop, king d3, and black played h6. Donoso had conceived quite a bright counterplan. His idea was to place as many pawns as possible on dark squares, thus making his bishop a better piece and removing the targets from my bishop. So I continued my advance. White pawn came to h4. Apparently that leaves the pawn on g4 hanging, but of course white could recapture on c6. So black played his rook from e8 to c8, defending the c6 pawn. Now he's really threatening bishop takes g4. So I gained some more space. Pawn from f4 to f5. This may look a little funny because I'm putting pawns on the same colour square as my bishop. On the other hand, the pawns on g4 and f5 certainly hem in the black bishop too. So there are advantages and disadvantages in my decision. Now, switch off for a second and see if you can find black's next move. I think what he played was the best choice. So, how would you defend this position as black? I think if black captures on f5 with the pawn, I retake with the bishop. Black has to take with his bishop on f5, and I take back with the rook. And after rook g8, I play g5. Now I can play my king over to support the g-pawn, and then black's f-pawn becomes very weak. I think black defended better than this. Put white's pawn back on g4 from g5, put white's rook back on c5, black rook to c8 from g8, black bishop on d7, white bishop on e4, black pawn on g6, white pawn f5. Black played g5, quite in line with his policy of putting his pawns on the other colour square from his bishop. Now I played a very good move, rook from c5 to c1. The idea of this is to gain control of the h-file. If black plays f6, I simply capture on g5 and play rook h1. Or if he plays rook h8 in answer to rook c1, I just play rook h1 and then capture on g5. So once again black found a move quite consistent with the idea of putting all the pawns on dark squares. He played g takes h4. Rook h1, f6, rook takes pawn, rook h8. And now the second adjournment was coming to a close. So I played a few moves so I just could analyse the position at leisure. Rook h2, king c7, bishop f3, king d6, rook b2, king c7, rook h2, king d6, and now I sealed rook to b2. Many hours of adjournment analysis began to convince me that this position was probably a draw, although white did have one or two small winning chances. When we resumed next morning, I put the plan I'd found into action. Of course, white's main threat is to penetrate the b-file, so black has to play his king back from d6 to c7, which he did. And now comes the winning attempt. King from d3 to e3. Rook from h8 to b8. Rook from b2 to h2. Now, pretend you're black again, and have a think. How would you defend this position? There are two possibilities: counterattack on the queen side, or passive defence on the king side. What would you choose? I wonder if you got this right. The only possible defence now is to play the rook from b8 to b3, check. The white king must go to f4, and now rook b4. If rook takes h6, rook takes d4, check. King e3, rook d6. And black is okay. Now please replace the pieces. Put the black rook back on b8, replace the white pawn on d4, put white's rook back on h2, and give black his pawn back on h6. So active defence was correct. Luckily for me, my opponent played rook h8, trusting in the solidity of his position. But this was illusory. Now the manoeuvre continued. King to f4, king to d6, some more massage, rook to b2, king to c7, king to g3, rook to b8, rook to h2. Now, with white's king secure from the checks, it's much too late to play actively. Black has to defend quietly. Rook went back to h8. Rook to c2. That threatens d5. Black's king went to d6. And now rook b2. This is another good moment to stop and think about the position. Can you see why white's winning? The answer is if black plays king c7. Switch off for a moment and think about it. Black plays king c7. White plays king h4. And it's Zugzwang. Black doesn't have a move. If he moves his king, rook to b6. And if he moves his rook to b8, or anywhere along the back rank, I either exchange rooks and play king h5, or play king h5 at once. So that leaves bishop to e8. And now I play rook from b2 to c2, threatening d5. If the king goes to d6, rook c5 wins a pawn, and if the king goes to b6, rook e2. And white's rook penetrates either at e6 or e7 with an easy win. Please replace the pieces. King from h4 to g3. King from b6 to d6. Bishop from e8 to d7. And rook from e2 to b2. So, instead of allowing this, black spotted the trap. Well, it wasn't really a trap, he couldn't do anything about it, and gave up a pawn for active counterplay. But it was a bit too late for that. He played his rook from h8 to e8. Rook to b6. Rook to e3. Rook to a6. Now there's no time for rook d3 because of d5, so black played king c7. Rook a7 check. King d6. king f4, rook c3, rook takes a5, rook c4, king e3, rook c3 check, king e2, rook a3. Now you'll see that white's just won a pawn, and although the win isn't exactly easy, it's clear white is going to win this position. I began to feel very happy. I could see my Grandmaster title looming up in the not too distant future. So I played rook a6 now, threatening d5. Black played king c7. And though I thought for a while about playing d5, it seemed quite strong, but I wasn't completely sure that it worked. Anyway, I didn't want to risk anything by breaking open the position too early. So I played rook a7 check. My opponent played king d6 again, and now I wrote down the move rook a8 on my score sheet. Now, this was the start of a dispute. We had already endured one dispute in this particular match over John Nunn's win on time. Actually, his win on time was disallowed, and he had to win the game all over again. And this move that I wrote down started up another dispute. Originally, the third session, which we were now in, was planned to last from 9:30 AM until 1:30 PM. But now, at about 11:45 AM, an arbiter came to my board, threw down an envelope, and told me to seal a move. I knew the schedule perfectly well, and asked him several times whether he meant what he was saying, and I received nothing but repeated orders to seal a move. As I said, I'd written down 75 rook a8 on my score sheet, but now, faced with the prospect of some adjournment analysis, I decided that the most sensible thing was to repeat the position by playing my rook from a7 back to a6, in order to work out the complexities of king to c7 by black, pawn to d5, which I mentioned before. Since we would be adjourning, I could work this out at my leisure, having repeated the position twice. I took 10 minutes over sealing rook from a7 to a6, just to make sure I was only repeating for the second time. Then I crossed out rook a8 and wrote down rook a6. My opponent had meanwhile finished making out the envelope. I sealed the move. As I was leaving the tournament hall, I ran into another arbiter, apparently a more senior one, who, on learning we had adjourned, threw a fit, and demanded that my move be promptly unsealed, and that we resume playing, according to the original schedule. You can see that the arbiters were perhaps a trifle confused as to their own intentions in this tournament. Naturally, I objected to this, since I just wasted 10 valuable minutes sealing one move, when normally I would have played something else, instantly. A huge argument developed, and eventually I tried to close it off by withdrawing my claim to adjourn, as per arbiter number 1, and substituting a request for a short break, so that I could calm my nerves down before resuming play. To my complete surprise, the more senior of the two arbiters now caved in completely and ordered a 3-hour adjournment pause. But that's not the end of the story at all. So I sealed rook a6, we stopped for 3 hours, and on resumption play continued, black king to c7. I had now worked out that d5 wasn't any good at all, so I repeated the position to get back to what I wanted to play before the arbiters interfered. White rook came to a7 check. Black king went to d6, and the white rook went to a8. A little late, but basically the same as before. Now black's best defence in this position is rook a2 check. In the long run it loses. But what he played was king to e7. Black king from d6 to e7, which is actually rather weak. In reply, I played my rook back from a8 to a6 again, and this is an exceptionally strong move, and my opponent had completely overlooked it. The point is that the only move that protects c6 is rook c3. But then black's rook is no longer behind the passed a pawn, and I simply push it up to a6, winning rather easily. The important thing is that black's king can never come to d6 now, in view of the thrust d5, winning at once. But my opponent thought otherwise. In fact, he now announced his intention of playing king from e7 to d6, and claimed a draw by repetition. He didn't play the move, he just announced his intention of playing it. That's what you have to do in such situations. If you play the move, you forfeit your rights. So he said he was going to play king d6 and claimed a draw by threefold repetition. Unfortunately, his claim was completely dismissed by the arbiter, since a different player to move was to move on the third occasion, and of course this invalidates the repetition, as I well knew. But the really unfortunate aspect of Donoso's intention to play king d6 was that according to FIDE rules, he now had to play the move because he'd announced it. So, king d6, and of course I played d5. This wins at once. The last few moves were a bit pathetic. Black king went to e5, white pawn took on c6, black bishop went to c8, white rook went to a8, black king went to f4, and my bishop went to d5, and Donoso resigned, signing both the score sheets as 1-0. One might have regarded this as the end of the game, not a bit of it. Next morning, the Chilean captain appealed against the result of the game, and demanded a complete replay from move 1, on the grounds that the game had been illegally adjourned at one point. Of course this claim was absurd, and hardly legal in itself, since players can't be penalised for mistakes by the arbiters, but the appeals committee of 5 convened, and decided in England's favour by 3 votes to 2. Further comment would involve me in a libel action, so I will content myself by listing the members of the committee with their nationalities, and leave the listener to draw his own conclusions as to the voting and the motives for it. The members were Vranizic, Canada; Pauli, Italy; Campomanes, Philippines; de Grief, Colombia, and an Israeli chairman, a very fair and impartial person. It seems to me that some players are not happy to play chess over the board, but prefer to continue the struggle under it when the result does not suit them.